Howdy. This is a channel I decided to make, and I'm going to call it Hagology. Hagology.
I like it.
So this is a video I was inspired to make by an article called Paul Kammerer and the Law of Seriality by this guy, the astrologist John Townley. Now, astrology has historically been kind of a mystical practice. A lot of people nowadays consider it a pseudoscience and think things like horoscopes and astrological signs are just plain superstition. And I personally have never believed in astrology because it seems like just that random, vague fortune-telling that doesn't really have value beyond entertainment. Townley, however, is serious about astrology. And he wrote this article claiming that there really could be scientific validity to the claims astrologists make about how the movements of the planets affect our lives if we just developed the right scientific infrastructure. And for this video, I just wanted to lay out his arguments and consider it critically. Now, in order to understand Townley's argument, we first have to know about this guy, Paul Kammerer. He's an Austrian biologist born in 1880 and who committed suicide in 1926 after being accused of performing fraudulent experiments and losing his academic credibility. Kammerer, beyond being a biologist, was also extremely interested in coincidences, which led him to develop an idea called the law of seriality. And it's this law of seriality that's fundamental to Townley's defense of astrology. Townley's formulation of the law is this. There are these things called complex systems. A complex system is a group of many interacting entities and mechanisms that form a complete whole. An example might be a company. There are many employees who work together, filing budget reports and buying or selling products to achieve a single goal, usually to make money. Another complex system could be the solar system, or all the bacteria in my gut, or any other bureaucratic organization. Now, these complex systems have certain properties. The same way that Newton said physical things have unbreakable laws that dictate their movement, these complex systems also have laws that dictate how they'll act. And the laws that dictate how systems will act are very similar or almost the same as how physical things will act. For example, physical things have inertia, a tendency to stay as they are. Systems have their own kind of inertia. Kammerer calls this quality persistence, wherein they tend to sustain and renew themselves even in the face of damage. And as a system continues to be sustained, those qualities strengthen. Think of a corporation. Say a quality that a corporation has is that it is evil. It makes immoral decisions like using sweatshop labor or spilling oil on the Gulf Coast or whatever. It seems pretty clear that the older the corporation gets and continues to make evil decisions, the less likely it is that that company will have a sudden change of heart or turn over a new leaf. Take the solar system. It is extremely old. Even without a deep knowledge of astronomy, it seems pretty obvious that it will continue to act exactly as it always has. That is, it is a complex system that has built up lots of inertia over time. Sometimes a complex system, as Townley says, can break apart, and its pieces carry with them the same qualities that developed in the original system, and these qualities continue to develop in the individual pieces. Townley describes these pieces floating beyond our bandwidth of perception, which I think is just a fancy way of saying they're just too small or inconsequential to notice. But sometimes the pieces of a system meet back up again, and that brings us to coincidence. Townley describes coincidence as any time two meaningful things happen to a person when their only connection is that they happen at the same time. Imagine you're on vacation in France, and suddenly you see someone from your hometown. Two meaningful things have happened, being in France and seeing someone you know. It's a coincidence because they happen at the same time, even though it seems so improbable. Or imagine you're playing poker and you're on a hot streak. Two meaningful things. You're engaged in the game of poker and you keep receiving good hands. No matter how improbable, you just can't seem to lose. These are instances of those pieces of complex systems reconverging. Kammerer is famous for recording tons of these coincidences, from the absolutely banal to the extreme and mysterious. He was known to sit in a park and record things like how many people walked by and how many of them were holding umbrellas. He believed that we could make a scientific infrastructure that categorized and predicted these complex systems such that we could make predictions about these coincidences. That alone is a pretty radical idea, but where does astrology come into this? After all, even if I could predict when I'm going to do well at poker, it's pretty difficult to imagine how planets affect me in any way. Well, that comes down to how Kammerer tried to determine or make into law the way these systems interact with each other. Along with quality persistence, Kammerer came up with two sub-concepts: imitation and abstraction. Imitation is just what it sounds like. Systems which are near to each other tend to become alike over time. Think of an ecosystem. Animals evolve to have similar survival strategies over time, probably because it's the best survival strategy. But the system of their biology achieves this through imitation. Attraction is also just what it sounds like. Systems with similar qualities tend to move closer together. Think of corporations and Wall Street. All the biggest buildings on Wall Street are insurance companies. They didn't all start there, but because they are systems with similar qualities, they tended to move closer to each other. After all, birds of a feather flock together. Townley suggests that what's implied in these laws is that information, like matter, is never destroyed. It is only dispersed and vanishes from our bandwidth of perception, as he says, until it reappears through these meaningful happenstances. For the planets and their positions, which is the subject of astrology, there are empirical effects that they have on the Earth. They change the tides and the electromagnetism in measurable ways. The month of the year affects the climate of a region. Townley says that these repeated system influences that the planets have on the Earth over millions of years set up and enforce a multitude of parallel systems purely through attraction to those influences and the imitation of them. These influences, the positions of the planets, therefore create repeated, predictable phenomena. And the reason that contemporary science fails to make those predictions is that we have not developed the scientific infrastructure of complex systems like we have for other fields. Townley notes that there are a multitude of other fields that could be substantiated by the study of complex systems. History, for example. People often say that history repeats itself. It's plausible that this repetition is a convergence of systems. In anthropology, it's a mystery as to why disparate cultures build similar structures like pyramids, even though they have no practical value. Ghost sightings and divination devices and the significance of sacred places might all be explained by the convergence of certain systems that we're not quite able to explain yet. Criticism. I think Townley's essay is definitely worth consideration. It attempts to give a somewhat rigorous explanation of why modern science has failed to validate the study of astrology. And Kammerer's law of seriality certainly wasn't just pseudoscience. Einstein, in fact, called it, quote, interesting and by no means absurd. And there are already rigorous studies of complex systems that have given rise to chaos theory and game theory, but those studies just didn't exactly go in the direction that Kammerer or Townley envisioned. I won't go deep into what I think the flaws of Townley's arguments really are. I think that forming a rigorous criticism of it is actually much more difficult than you'd think. One aspect of Townley's argument is that it cannot be refuted through scientific evidence. Since Townley's argument is that the scientific infrastructure we use today is insufficient to account for astrological phenomena, then using scientific evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient to refute his claim. Therefore, we have to engage with Townley philosophically and refute his premises or the construction of his argument. I will mention one counter-argument that I found interesting, courtesy of my friend Nick. Nick said, if all these systems build up their parallel imitation and attraction to one another over time, then whichever system you choose to make your predictions should be arbitrary. Why study the positions of the planets when I could study the progressive color of my urine over time and get the same results? That is, Townley's argument doesn't point out why the positions of the planets have any particular relevance to our local systems besides them being very old. Therefore, I should be able to derive the same results from any other system that's also old. I could evaluate your personality based on the stock market numbers of the day you were born, or I could read my future love life in geological movements. Earthquakes are bad, but tsunamis are very sexy. Anyways, that's all I have to say on that. Are you convinced? Do you read your horoscope? And do you do it for fun, or do you think someday we'll prove that horoscopes are really meaningful? Until next time, that's Hagology.